Hi, I'm Rebecca Stafford, and today I will be presenting my advocacy plan on why heritage is more than infrastructure. The Heritage Act 1977 was implemented in New South Wales to promote protection and conservation of items and places that are significant to the state. State significance is described as a building, place, or precinct that possesses significance in historical, cultural, scientific, architectural, natural, or social value. The State Heritage Register was implemented in 1999 under the Heritage Act to ensure state significant items and places were legally protected. The register aims to guarantee that items and places that were significant to New South Wales' identity and history would be conserved for future generations. The problem with the Heritage Act is in regard to protecting and conserving buildings that hold state significance, specifically public housing complexes. The Act is effectively protecting infrastructure, however it does not protect the intended purpose of a building. This is evident as the State Heritage Register has 241 public housing complexes listed, but they are no longer used for public housing. This is a major social issue because Australia has an extremely unaffordable housing market, one of the worst in the world. Due to this, Australia has seen a reduction in home ownership, a shortage in public housing, a rise in homelessness, and a greater disadvantage within the private renting market. Basically, finding shelter and accessing housing within Australia is a struggle for the majority of the population. However, the most vulnerable, those who are economically disadvantaged, find it near impossible to access secure housing in such a demanding market. This is why public housing is an important resource for vulnerable Australians. Currently, there are over 150,000 people on the public housing waiting list, and they could be waiting for up to 10 years. Therefore, it is crucial to protect public housing complexes as they not only provide access to secure housing, but they improve the quality of life for vulnerable people. In the last decade, there has been a growing threat in Sydney to redevelop public housing complexes. This is due to the stigmatisation of public housing tenants and the power the government holds. Historically, the government protected public housing tenants from being displaced, however the government now partakes in state-led evictions. In 2014, the New South Wales government sold 293 public housing complexes within the historic suburbs of Millers Point and The Rocks. This resulted in nearly 600 tenants to be relocated to alternate public housing complexes. Similarly, researchers have agreed that gentrification is causing the government to displace public housing tenants. State-led gentrification involves transforming a community's culture to promote wealth in property value instead of supporting current residents. For instance, the Ceres public housing complex in The Rocks failed to gain heritage status, letting it to be sold to developers. This highlights how the government failed to support the welfare of the state, instead supporting profit motives of an individual. Even if the Ceres building gained heritage status, there was no guarantee the building would be used as public housing. This is because the Heritage Act does not protect public housing complexes from being sold or allowing new tenants to occupy the building. This is why the advocacy plan aims to create change, ensuring the intended purpose of public housing is secure. Correspondingly, researchers have explored the implications and emotions that public housing tenants endured from being displaced. Tenants are removed from a well-established community where they have a sense of belonging. It's more than a roof over your head. The friendships made within the complex are extremely valued. Additional implications of being displaced include access to education, employment opportunities, and adequate transport options. This causes issues for tenants to access essential services, amenities, and opportunities. Lastly, tenants feel worthless as they are aware the government is valuing economic gain over their quality of life. The unequal societal structures generate tenants to feel vulnerable, isolated, excluded, and feeling powerless. Now that you have knowledge of the issue at hand, I'll explain what this advocacy plan aims to achieve. This campaign plans to implement policy change to the Heritage Act within 5 years. The policy change will include protection of the intended purpose of a state significant building. To achieve this, there will be two groups. Firstly, the working group consists of people affected by the issue and members of the public interested in the issue. The group size would be capped to 25 people, otherwise it becomes too difficult to make decisions. This working group would be responsible for research, proposing ideas, and helping with public petitions. The second group is the leadership group. It will consist of a key number of members from the working group who have a strong knowledge of the issue and policy skills, including myself. This group would be responsible for letter writing, meeting with key contacts, presenting the issue, and maintaining follow-up and progress of the campaign. To achieve policy change, the following strategy is proposed. Firstly, Step 1. the target audience. The New South Wales Government, in particular the Heritage Council of New South Wales and the Minister for Planning. Our key message is the Heritage Act 1977 must be changed to protect the purpose of state heritage buildings, especially public housing complexes. For example, if a public housing complex gains heritage status, it must continue to house public housing tenants. The second step is conducting research. Research will be undertaken by the team and will include research in relation to the topic from literature resources, organisational and department reports, and media resources. This research will be used as evidence to argue the case for change. Thirdly, communicating the message. The message would be delivered through letters to local politicians to attempt to establish a relationship to get an authoritative figure on board with the campaign. In relation to the public, an online petition would be set up to gain power in size. The fourth step is building relationships locally. Following up from the letter to local politicians, the leadership group should continue to stay in contact with interested politicians. This will help in the follow-up steps as the government may be more willing to respond to a person who holds power. The fifth step includes contacting the government via a letter to the Minister of Planning. The Minister of Planning leads the Heritage Council of New South Wales, which guides the Heritage Office. The letter will outline the proposed changes to the Heritage Act 1977 and will request to meet with policymakers for discussion. The next step is building relationships at the state level. This provides the stepping stone to meet with the government to advocate for policy change. Having political representatives will ensure the message is conveyed to the target audience. The seventh step, meeting with the state government, will involve meeting with political representatives to maintain a solid relationship. This will lead to political representatives taking our inquiries to the House of Representatives, specifically question time. This could lead to further meetings with the state to discuss the proposed changes to the policy. Lastly, follow-up contact with the state is crucial for checking progress and keeping actions on track. If the government is not attempting to make any changes, requesting another meeting to present our issue may be established. Follow-up is a key component because if you do not keep the issue present, it will be pushed to the side. To summarise, the strategy for the campaign is to build key local and state relationships with politicians and policymakers to get the issue heard. Once these relationships are established, meetings will occur to discuss what actions need to be taken and how to implement them to achieve our policy goal. The key tool for this advocacy campaign is lobbying skills. For this campaign to be successful, it is critical for this tool to be utilised. Lobbying skills are used for petitions, letter writing, relationship building, and meeting with the government. The skills include being prepared, having a clear message, knowing the target audience, research, building relationships, regular contact, being polite, negotiation techniques, active listening, asking questions. There will always be opposition to campaigns. I will discuss a few potential questions that may be raised for this campaign. Opposition 1. Policy change is not required as public housing tenants who are displaced gain access to new public housing. Yes, public housing tenants do receive access to new housing, however they are removed from a community where they have a sense of belonging. The change in policy is not in relation to infrastructure, but it is in relation to protecting a sense of place, identity and history. This is because of the connections, friendships and sense of belonging to a community within public housing complexes. Imagine living in the same home for 35 years and you were forced out because the government was more interested in making a profit. You would be in a new community where you would not know anyone, have no support network and were a long distance from transport and essential services. You would be left feeling alone, vulnerable and disconnected. Opposition 2. Heritage status has no relation to the purpose of the building. The Heritage Register aims to conserve items and places that are significant to New South Wales' identity and history. This implies that the Heritage Act 1977 recognises the connectiveness of a place is not just associated with infrastructure. Heritage values embrace social morals, community cohesion, identity and history. This is why the intended purpose of a heritage building must be protected. For instance, conserving public housing complexes through the heritage status is to protect the essential service it provides for vulnerable population. The heritage status is not granted because of the infrastructure, but because of the important value and services it has provided for the community over many generations. Opposition 3. Public housing does not have a place in gentrified communities. Removing public housing from gentrified communities would intensify the geographical divide between social classes. The injustices between social classes is already prominent within society and it does not need to be exacerbated. The stigmatization of public housing tenants needs to be diminished and for society to view every citizen as equal. Every citizen has equal worth, has a right to meet essential needs, and the ability to access equal opportunities within society. Therefore, why is it that public housing tenants must be displaced and be further from essential services and opportunities? It is not socially just to degrade citizens based on their housing situation. No member of society is more important or worthy than another. This advocacy plan has made me aware how complex and how much work needs to go into creating a campaign. It was interesting to work backwards to figure out what needed to be done to achieve my goal. It was challenging at times as there are so many different tools to choose from, but it was important to narrow down what tools were the most appropriate. I think I spent the most time questioning and second-guessing myself if I had covered every aspect required to achieve my goal. Additionally, establishing the opposition poses a challenge, as I had never given thought to how others may view this issue, but it was a way for me to emphasise why changing the Heritage Act policy is so important.